Every single one of our lives is a stewardship. Every single one of our lives are something that have been entrusted to each and every one of us by God that He is calling us to be faithful with. Your family, your relationships with your siblings, they're a stewardship. Your friends and your acquaintances, they're a stewardship. Your teams and your clubs and your choirs, they're a stewardship. Your body is a stewardship. Your job, your car, your attitudes, your actions, your gifts, they are all stewardships. Every single area of our lives, every single part of our stories are all a stewardship. They are something that has been entrusted to us by God that He is calling us to be faithful with. And what I mean whenever I say it's something that has been entrusted to us by God is this. It's that it's not ours. My life does not belong to me. Your life does not belong to you. But my life and your life belongs to Jesus. And whenever we are faithful, that's all that God is calling us to be, is to be faithful with the lives that He's given us with every single moment. Whether we have years or decades to live, or whether we have mere moments to live, all we are called to do is to simply be good stewards of the time that He has given us. We've been called to be faithful. We've been called to be obedient. And whenever you really stop to think about it, this makes sense, right? I mean, if the entire point of what we talked about this week, if the entire point of our lives is to join in on what God's doing, if it is to join in on God's greater story and not just expect for God to come and join in on our story, this is the way that it has to be. Daily living our lives, striving not for certain results. I want you to hear that again. Striving not for certain results, but simply striving to be obedient. Striving to be faithful with each and every moment that we are given. And whenever we take a step back, this is really what we see in Elijah's story. This man that James, the brother of Jesus, said is just like us. This is what we see in his story over and over again. Through his victories and through his defeats, through his pain and through his triumph, through his joy and through his depression, with varying levels of success, we see someone who is desperately wanting to be faithful, to be obedient, to be a good steward of what God has entrusted to him. So as we come to the end of this week, Elijah, he's coming to the end of his journey as well. He's about to reach his destination. His time on earth is almost over, and we're going to learn such an important lesson today, and I want you to hear what this lesson is. Our stories cannot end with us. You got that? I want to make sure everybody's awake today. I mean, I know everybody is completely wiped out, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Everybody is exhausted, so I want you to repeat after me. Our stories cannot end with us. Okay, I heard about like 25% of you actually say it. So for the other 75% of everybody in here, let's try this again. Our stories cannot end with us. And over the course of several years, Elijah, he has been pouring into Elisha. And this incredibly deep bond has formed over time. It has been many years since Elisha left his wealth, he left his property, he left his home, he left his comfort to hit the road with Elijah. And now in Elijah's final moments, he is making the final preparations for Elijah's story, for his story to be continued through Elisha. If you have your Bibles, if you have your Bible apps today, you can go ahead and open up to 2 Kings chapter 2. 2 Kings chapter 2, and we're going to start in verse 1 and read around the first 10 verses today. It says this: When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal, and Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of prophets at Bethel, they came out to Elisha, and they asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Yes, I know, Elisha replied. So be quiet. Don't talk about it. We don't need to go there right now. We all understand where Elisha is in this moment. Somehow they know that this is going to be Elijah's last day. And many of us in this room, we've experienced time in a season in our life to where we knew that a family member or a loved one, that their time on this earth was starting to come to a close. And whenever you would get together with family, it's almost like you would make this little eye contact. Like, yes, we know what's going on, but we don't have to talk about it. We don't have to get into it right now. And that's what Elisha is doing here. Then Elijah said to Elisha, stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. So they went to Jericho. And the company of prophets of Jericho, they went up to Elisha and they asked him, do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Yes, I know, he replied. So be quiet. We don't need to talk about it. Then Elijah said to him, stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live. You guys kind of seeing a theme here, a little bit of a pattern? I will not leave you. So the two of them walked on. And 50 men from the company of the prophets, they went and they stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped in the Jordan. And Elijah took off his cloak, and he rolled it up, and he struck the water. And the water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them, they crossed over on dry ground. So I don't know exactly how all of this came to be, but somehow God has made it clear to Elijah and Elisha that this will be Elijah's last day on earth. So what does Elijah do is he begins to take this trip, kind of this trip down memory lane, kind of this trip that is just reminding him of the faithfulness of God. And it's no coincidence that Elisha is with him here, because what Elijah is doing in these final moments that he has on this earth is he is showing Elisha God has been faithful in the past. And if God has been faithful in the past, we can know that God will continue to be faithful in the future. So they go to this place called Gilgal. In Gilgal, it was known as the place of the beginning. This is where the Israelites, they camped before they entered the promised land. If you remember, we go back to, I believe it was night one. And Bradley, he on the video, he came and he gave us like this really quick lesson on Israel's history. And it started with this man by the name of Abraham. And Abraham, he was going to have many sons. And many sons were going to have this guy named Father Abraham. You know, right arm, left arm, the whole 9 yards. And Abraham, he had a son by the name of Isaac. And Isaac had a couple of sons. One of them was Jacob. And Jacob, he had 12 sons. And one of them was Joseph. And Joseph, he was despised by his brothers. But in all the time that his brothers were trying to destroy him, God had this incredible plan for Joseph. And eventually Joseph, he ends up finding himself as the number 2 guy in all of the land of Egypt. And as long as Joseph was alive and as long as Joseph was remembered, the Israelites were treated well in Egypt. But as soon as people forgot about Joseph, they began to treat the Israelites very, very, very poorly. They made them slaves, and for 400 years they were slaves until this man by the name of Moses came. And Moses came and he said to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, let my people go. And Pharaoh said no, and he said that I'm going to do something, let my people go. No, and he just kept doing these 8 signs, these 8 plagues, until finally Pharaoh let the Israelites go. And Moses, he led these people towards this land that had been promised to Abraham so many years before. But because of the Israelites' disobedience, they didn't get to just make a straight trek to the promised land. They see God act on their behalf in so many powerful ways. Yet they still can't believe that God is actually going to take care of them. You know, we're hungry, and so God provides food from heaven. We're thirsty, and so God provides water from a rock. But yet they just continue to complain and continue to complain. This happens for 40 years until eventually Joshua takes the reign from Moses. And Joshua is the one who finds himself on the cusp of the promised land, leading this rebellious people, this stiff-necked people, into the promised land. And right before they entered the promised land, they came to this place called Gilgal. And God had acted on their behalf in such an amazing way that they took 12 stones out of the Jordan River, and they go and they camp in Gilgal, and they build this altar, this monument. That its entire purpose, if you read in Joshua chapter 4 and 5, the entire purpose of this monument was to remind future generations of God's faithfulness. That's the first place that Elijah and Elisha find themselves. Then they go to this place called Bethel. And Bethel was a place of remembrance. Early in Jewish history, Bethel, it played such a prominent role. Abraham, he met with God at Bethel, and he built an altar there. Jacob, Abraham's grandson, had the Lord appear to him through a dream at Bethel. It was there that God revealed the plans that he had for Jacob's life. And Jacob, he built an altar there. And later, after reconciling with his brother Esau, God tells Jacob to go back to Bethel and to build yet another altar. It was at Bethel where God blessed Jacob and changed his name to Israel. And Elijah would have known all this history. Elisha would have known all this history. And in this place, they are remembering the faithfulness of God. And don't you just know that in this moment, Elijah, as he knows his life is coming to an end, and as he's remembering God's faithfulness, he remembers going to the home of the widow. And he remembers how God provides. He remembers going to Mount Carmel, and he remembers how God provides. He remembers how God has been faithful to him. So then they move to a place called Jericho. And many of you, if you're in choir, you sang a song about Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Anybody know this song? The adults and like 4 people. Okay. So, but we know that Jericho, it is a place of battle. And again, this is a place that holds such a prominent place in Jewish history. This is the place where God tore down the walls, and after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Israel began to take hold of the promised land. And in this place of battle, I have to believe that Elijah, he's thinking about all the battles that he's been through. His battle that he had on Mount Carmel. The battles that he had with Ahab. The battles that he had with Jezebel. He's been on the run. He's had a bounty placed on his head. He's had to fight. He's battled depression. He's found himself in a pit of despair. He's found himself hiding in a cave, wishing he could just die. He's faced his battles, but here in this place, he remembers that God has never left him in his battles. And then finally, they come to the place of Jordan. And this is a place of surrender. This is the end of the road, and in this place of surrender, we remember that Elijah, he had to learn to die to himself at the very, very beginning. He had to learn to rely on God at the ravine, waiting for the ravens to come and feed him. He had to surrender his plans. He had to surrender his wishes, and it was at the Jordan where he learned this. And at every step of the way on this journey that Elijah is taking Elisha on, he is pointing to the faithfulness of God. He's pointing Elisha back, and he's continuing to prepare him for the future. But did you guys notice something whenever we were reading the text a little bit earlier? That every time that Elijah went to a new town, Elisha stubbornly yet beautifully refuses to listen to Elijah's order. Elijah said, I want you to stay here. And time after time, Elisha stubbornly yet beautifully refuses. And I believe that the question that Elisha had to answer is the exact same question that I believe each and every one of us have to answer as we are preparing to leave this place. As we are preparing to go back home, as Damien talked about last night, some of you are going back to situations that you do not want to find yourself in. Some of you are terrified to go back home because you know that God's doing something in your life. And you know, as soon as your mom or your dad ask, how was CIY? And you try to explain what God has done in your life this week, that they're just not going to get it. And all the support that you felt this week is going to just evaporate in a moment. And so the thing that Elisha is having to answer is the same thing that we have to answer. And it's this: will you persist? Will you persist? When it is difficult, will you persevere? When you feel like quitting, will you remain obedient? when it doesn't make sense, will you remain faithful just as Jesus has remained faithful to you? Verse 9 of 2 Kings chapter 2, it says, so when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you? And Elisha replied, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. You have asked a difficult thing, Elijah said. Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not. As it would turn out, Elisha would end up performing exactly twice the number of miraculous signs that Elijah had performed. But what Elisha's request is not really this request for the miraculous. What Elisha's request was a request of birthright. He was basically saying, Elijah, I want to be like your firstborn. I want to have the blessings of being your firstborn. His request, it speaks volumes about their relationship. Elisha is saying, I want to just carry on what it is that you've already begun. And I can tell you as a father, I can tell you as a pastor, I hope that my greatest kingdom work, I hope that my greatest kingdom impact is not something that I do. But I hope that my greatest kingdom work and my greatest kingdom impact is somebody that I raise. I hope that it's Whitley. I hope that it's Ava. I hope that it's Nora. I hope that they didn't end up doing so much more for the kingdom than I ever could even begin to imagine. I hope that it's somebody that God brings into my life that I have the opportunity to pour into them, to encourage them, to hopefully be able to show them who Jesus is and the plans that he has for them. I want that to be my greatest kingdom impact. I want that to be my kingdom story. Not me, but someone else. And Elisha is saying to Elijah, will you please let me carry on what it is that you've already done? Will you please hand me the baton and let me run? Elijah's response, it spoke volumes to stewardship. You see, Elijah's job was simply to be faithful. And his response to Elisha at this incredible request was, that's not for me to decide. If you see me, then you will know that it's been given to you. But it is completely up to God to give the results. And I hope that that can give you so much peace in your life. Whenever you go home, it is your job to be faithful. You cannot save your family. Only Jesus can save your family. But you can be faithful in sharing the love of Jesus with your family and letting your family see Jesus' love in you. That's your job. Saving them is Jesus' job. You got that? That should lift a weight off of your shoulders. That should lift a weight off of your shoulders, but that's the truth, and that's what Elijah understood, and that's what he was saying to Elisha. That's not my job. All I can do is be faithful. I'll never forget this moment in my life because I don't feel like I give very good advice most of the time. Whenever people in my church, they come to me and they're like, Andy, can I meet with you and talk to you? I'm like, yeah, if that's what you want to do, but I want you to know I'm really, really bad at this most of the time. I'm not a very good listener. I always try to fix people, which is one of my problems, and I don't have the power to do that. But there was this one moment in time whenever I got it right. It was right after my grandpa. I showed you guys this picture a couple of days ago. It was right after he passed away. And I came home for his funeral and got to spend a few days with my family. And it was time for my wife and I and my brother and his family to hop in a car to drive back up to Kansas City, to hop on a plane to fly back home. And I remember walking out to the car, and my mom and my grandma, they came out with me, with us. And I hugged my mom who had just lost her dad, and she's just weeping on my shoulder, and I am squeezing her and letting her know that I love her. And then my grandma, my beautiful, lovely grandma, she comes up and she just melts into my side. And she says, Andy, I don't know what I'm going to do. I said, Grandma, here's what I want to encourage you with. Have a good day. But Grandma, if you can't make it a whole good day, then have a good morning. But if you can't make it a whole good morning, then have a good hour. But if you can't make it a whole hour, then have a good minute. And if you can't make it a whole minute, then in this moment, Grandma, let it be good. Church, I want to give you the exact same encouragement that I gave my grandma all those years ago. Whenever you go home, be faithful that day. But if you cannot be faithful that whole day, then be faithful that morning. But if you can't be faithful that whole morning, then be faithful in that hour. And if you cannot be faithful for an entire hour, then in that minute, be faithful. And if you cannot be faithful for an entire minute, then in that moment, these 3 seconds of bravery, be faithful. Be faithful. Be faithful. Then you get through that moment, and guess what? You have another moment that you can be faithful. You get through that moment, you have another moment where you can be faithful. We have to carry on the story. You guys had names, you had family, you had coaches, you had friends all over these boards last night. They need to hear about the love of Jesus from you. Don't expect somebody else to do it. It's not your job to get the results, but it's your job to be faithful. And the reason this is such a big deal is because Jesus Christ, He really lived, He really died, and He really resurrected from the dead. And if that's true, we live in a lost, we live in a dark, we live in a broken world. But if the resurrection of Jesus is true, that gives us hope for anything. That gives us hope for everything. And the people in your life that are hurting, the people in your life that are broken, they can have the hope that they so desperately desire because of the resurrection of Jesus. And you know it, and I know it. And now it's our job to take it, to be faithful, to be obedient, to be faithful, to be obedient. This day, this morning, this hour, this moment, this minute, be faithful. Because our stories cannot end with us. Your greatest kingdom impact cannot be you. Your story must to be continued in someone else.